There are moments in history that begin so quietly that almost no one notices them. Not at first. There are no alarms ringing, no soldiers marching through the streets, no sudden catastrophe to warn the world that something extraordinary is about to begin. Instead, everything appears calm. If you had walked through many of the cities of Europe on that particular evening, you might have seen nothing unusual at all. The streets were softly lit by old lamps. In small cafes, people lingered over their final cups of coffee. Some men were reading newspapers, slowly turning the pages, pausing occasionally to study a headline. At nearby tables, others spoke in low voices about ordinary things. The weather, the price of bread, the football match that had taken place earlier that afternoon. From the outside, life looked exactly the way it always had. And yet, history has a peculiar habit of hiding its most important turning points inside the most ordinary evenings. Because sometimes when everything appears peaceful, something far more important is happening somewhere else. Not in the streets, not in government buildings, but inside the human mind. The year was 1939. Across Europe, a strange feeling had begun to settle over daily life. It was not panic. Not yet. It was something much quieter. A kind of tension that was difficult to describe. People sensed it in conversations, in the careful way neighbors spoke about politics, in the uneasy tone of radio broadcasts that played in the background of many homes. Even the newspapers seemed different now. The words were cautious. The headlines carried a weight that had not been there before. And yet, despite all of this, life continued. Children still ran through the streets. Farmers still worked their fields. Train stations were still filled with travelers heading toward places that, at the time, seemed perfectly ordinary. But something curious was happening beneath the surface of everyday life. In cafes, people were beginning to lower their voices. At dinner tables, conversations paused for a moment longer than usual. And in quiet homes across the continent, many people found themselves thinking about the same question, a question they rarely spoke aloud. What if this time things do not return to normal? Fear rarely arrives suddenly. It moves slowly, almost gently. A rumor heard on the radio, a newspaper article read late at night, a conversation overheard between strangers. And little by little, the mind begins to imagine possibilities that did not exist before. What if war is coming? What if everything changes? What if the world we know is about to disappear? The strange thing about the human mind is that once it begins imagining a future, it becomes very difficult to stop. Thought leads to thought. Concern leads to another concern. And soon, entire societies begin carrying the same invisible weight inside their thoughts. Historians often describe wars through maps and battles, through armies, borders, and strategies. But wars do not truly begin with soldiers. They begin earlier than that. They begin when ideas begin to move through the minds of millions of people. Ideas about fear, ideas about enemies, ideas about what might happen next. And in the late 1930s, those ideas were already spreading quietly across Europe. Long before the first bomb would fall, something had already begun. Something invisible, something powerful, something that moves through every generation of human history. Because the most powerful battlefield has never been land, or sea, or sky. It has always been the human mind. And on that quiet evening in 1939, as lights slowly went out in homes across Europe, and people prepared for sleep, millions of minds were still awake, thinking, wondering, imagining what the future might bring. None of them knew exactly what would happen next, but many of them could feel something approaching. A storm that had not yet appeared on the horizon, but was already gathering in silence. And when that storm finally arrived, the world would discover something unsettling. The war had not begun with the bombs. It had begun long before that. It had begun inside the mind. If you ask most people how wars begin, they will usually describe the same images. Soldiers marching, planes flying overhead, explosions in the distance. But historians who study human behavior often say something different. They say wars rarely begin with weapons. They begin with something far more subtle: ideas. Long before armies move across borders, something else begins to move quietly through societies. Words, stories, beliefs. And during the years leading up to the Second World War, those ideas were spreading faster than anyone could fully understand. At first, they appeared in speeches. Political leaders stood before large crowds and spoke about pride, strength, and the future of their nations. The crowds listened. Many nodded in agreement. But something interesting happens when the same message is repeated again and again. It slowly becomes familiar. And once an idea becomes familiar, the mind begins to accept it more easily. This was not an accident. In fact, during the 1930s, governments across Europe began to understand something that had rarely been studied before. The human mind could be influenced, not through force, but through repetition, through emotion, through carefully chosen words. In Germany, Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, believed deeply in this idea. He once said something that historians still quote today: "If you repeat a lie often enough, people will eventually believe it." Now, whether or not that statement was entirely true is still debated. But what is certain is that propaganda became one of the most powerful weapons of the era. Newspapers carried stories designed to shape opinion. Posters appeared on city walls with bold images and simple messages. Radio broadcasts filled homes with speeches and patriotic music. And slowly, almost invisibly, entire populations began to see the world in a new way. Enemies were described not as individuals, but as threats. Fear was transformed into anger. Uncertainty was replaced by conviction. What many people did not realize was that they were witnessing one of the largest psychological experiments in human history. The battlefield was not only land or sea, it was the human mind. And once ideas take root inside the mind, they become incredibly powerful. A single thought can influence a conversation. A conversation can influence a community. A community can influence a nation. This is how psychological forces move through history, quietly, gradually, often without anyone noticing. And by the late 1930s, millions of people across Europe had already begun to see the world through ideas that had been carefully planted. Some believed their nation was under threat. Others believed war was inevitable. Many believed they had no choice but to prepare. At the time, it seemed like politics. But looking back today, historians see something deeper. They see how entire societies were slowly guided toward a state of mind where war no longer seemed unthinkable. It seemed necessary. And once that idea becomes accepted, the final step is often only a matter of time. Because when enough minds begin to believe the same story, history begins to move. And that is exactly what was happening across Europe in those final months before the war began. But something even more unsettling was about to appear. Because once the war finally started, people would discover that the greatest weapon was not always the bomb, or the rifle, or the tank. It was something far more powerful, the human mind under pressure. And in the years that followed, soldiers, civilians, and entire nations would begin to experience a battle unlike any that had come before. A battle not only for territory, but for the human mind itself. And that battle was only beginning. There is something history books rarely capture. When we read about wars, we often see numbers, divisions of soldiers, dates of battles, lines moving across maps. But wars are not truly experienced through numbers. They are experienced through moments. Small, quiet moments that stay with a person for the rest of their life. One such moment happened to a young soldier in the winter of 1944. His name was Thomas Walker. He was 21 years old. He had grown up in a small town in Pennsylvania, where the loudest sound most evenings was the whistle of the evening train passing through the valley. Before the war, his life had been simple. He worked at his father's repair shop. On Sundays, he attended church with his mother. Sometimes in the evenings, he would sit on the wooden steps outside the house and watch the sunset fade slowly over the hills. War, for him, had once been something distant, something that happened in newspapers, something discussed by men on the radio. But by the winter of 1944, Thomas Walker found himself standing in a forest in Europe. The cold air cut through his uniform. Snow covered the ground around him. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with frost. It was late at night. The kind of night where the world becomes so quiet that even the smallest sound feels important. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled faintly like distant thunder. The soldiers around him were waiting for orders, waiting for morning, waiting for something none of them could fully see yet. Thomas leaned against a tree and tried to slow his breathing. But the mind does strange things in moments like that. When the body is still, the mind begins to wander. He thought about home, about the smell of oil in his father's workshop, about his younger sister who had written to him just 2 weeks earlier. She had asked him a simple question in her letter. "Do you think you will be home by Christmas?" He had stared at that sentence for a long time before folding the letter and placing it back in his pocket. The truth was, he didn't know. No one knew. A branch cracked somewhere in the darkness. Several soldiers lifted their heads instantly. Every sense became alert, but the sound faded. Perhaps it had only been the wind. Thomas exhaled slowly. And then something strange happened. In the silence of that frozen forest, he realized something that many soldiers would later describe in their own words. The most difficult battle was not always the one happening outside. It was the one happening inside the mind. Because when you stand in the darkness, waiting for something unknown to happen, your thoughts begin to move in directions you cannot control. You imagine possibilities. You replay memories. You ask questions that have no answers. What if tomorrow never comes? What if I never see home again? What if this night is the last quiet moment I will ever know? Around him, other soldiers stood in the same silence. Some stared into the darkness. Others held photographs of families they had left behind. No one spoke much. Words felt unnecessary. But inside every mind in that frozen forest, something was happening. A quiet battle. A battle between fear and courage, between doubt and determination, between the instinct to survive and the duty to continue forward. History remembers the battles that happened the next morning. It remembers the movements of armies and the shifting lines of the front. But few records describe what happened during that long night before the fighting began. The waiting, the thinking, the quiet struggle inside the human mind. And yet, in many ways, that silent battle may have been the most important one of all. Because every soldier standing in that forest had to face the same question. A question that history never fully answers. What does a human mind do when it stands at the edge of the unknown? And in the years that followed, psychologists and historians would begin to study something curious about soldiers in war. Not just how they fought, but how their minds endured the unimaginable. And what they discovered would change how we understand the human mind forever. But that discovery would come later. Because on that winter night in 1944, Thomas Walker was still standing in the snow, still listening to the distant rumble of artillery, still waiting for the morning. And like millions of others in that war, he was discovering something about the human mind that no one had fully understood before. Sometimes the greatest battlefield is the one inside us. But the story of this soldier does not end here. What happened after that night would change him forever. In the next chapters, we will explore the moment he was forced to make an impossible decision, the battle that would leave a permanent mark on his mind, and the silence that followed long after the war had ended. Because sometimes the real war only begins when the battlefield becomes quiet.